Hi everyone, this is Janaína here. We are going to start in a couple of minutes, just waiting for a little bit more people to join. Yeah, so just a couple of minutes to be with you shortly. Hi again, everyone. Welcome to another UXPA webinar. This is Janaína Pantoja here, Director of Education with UXPA International. We are very excited to bring this webinar and other educational initiatives to you. Today, our guest is Giles Harrison-Conwill. He is a cultural anthropologist and UX researcher at Google. He will be talking about ethnography. Before we start, just some housekeeping items. If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to use the GoToWebinar control panel. There is a tab that says questions. Send your questions and we get to them at the end of the presentation. We're gonna have about 15 minutes for questions, and Giles will get to your questions at the end. Also, we are recording the webinar and we'll share the link with you as soon as possible. And also the presenter will share the slides as well. So if you also have any suggestions for future webinars and speakers, please contact me at education@uxpa.org. And also don't miss the early bird rates for the UXPA conference this year. You can find more information at uxpa2018.org. So Giles, thanks for leading this webinar today. We are so excited about it. When you're ready, I would love for you to introduce yourself to folks attending the webinar today.
All right. So first of all, thanks so much, Janina, for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and the UXPA community about ethnography today. Just a little background about myself. I am a cultural anthropologist. In a past life, I studied things like citizenship and democracy in Venezuela, as well as tourism and identity in the Dominican Republic. These days, I work on communication products at Google. Here, I'm a UX researcher and absolutely love it every time that I get to do ethnographic research beyond the walls of the building where my desk sits. So with that, like I said, I've been looking forward to talking today about ethnographic research, something that I've found fascinating and really exciting for a really long time. Since you're here today for a UXPA International webinar, I think it's probably fair to assume that many of you are either students or UX professionals who are relatively new to ethnography. But there also might be some ethnographers who are here attending because they're interested in UX and how UXers might approach this method that they're pretty familiar with at this point. So many of you have varied interests and, of course, projects that ethnography might serve. So today I want to give you a sense of how you can potentially expand your UX practices with an ethnographic approach. And I'm going to assume that you're not totally new to UX research. So this probably means that you have some research practices that you've already adopted. You also might have research tools and supporting infrastructures that help you do things like recruit participants. And some of the things that I'll discuss today should help you make some steps towards conducting ethnographic research without necessarily breaking what you've already set up. All right, so just to get us started, I think it's really important to make sure that we're all standing on common ground. Everybody is kind of speaking the same language. So before we talk about what you might be able to do with ethnographic research, let's make sure that everybody's on the same page about what it is. So first of all, ethnography, a perfectly fine definition of ethnography is the study of people, the study of culture. Absolutely nothing wrong with this definition. But I also want to discuss the topic in terms that might be a little more helpful for someone working in UX today. So for today, I'm going to focus on ethnography as something slightly, I think, a little bit more meaningful for the work that we're up to. So I think of ethnography as a variety of research methods that utilize participant observation to understand people's beliefs and practices on their terms. And so here, when I say a variety of methods, I think a lot of people talk about ethnography as a method. And I suppose there's nothing wrong with talking about it that way, but as I think about what that actually means in terms of methodology and executing a research project, I don't think of it as a singular method. Usually this work requires researchers to do things like observe and document behavior, environments, and objects. And the sort of interpretive work that ethnographers undertake really requires directly communicating with research subjects. And off the bat, this means that ethnographers are using a combination of observation and interviewing in the work that they're doing. So, just thinking about where we start, it's not a single method that we're relying on. Also, I think it's important to take a moment to acknowledge that it's really notable that we want to examine people and culture from an emic perspective. An ethnographer's goal is to understand an experience from the participant's perspective. And doing this really means suspending your own worldview, beliefs, and even your expertise while collecting and making sense of ethnographic data. So how did we get here? In recent years, ethnography has been really praised as this kind of innovative method for businesses that are seeking an edge in serving its consumers, its users. But ethnography has been around for a really long time. Anthropologists have been closely associated with the practice since the days of Franz Boas, when he began to argue for these ideas like cultural relativity. And of course, at this point, anthropologists are not the only practitioners of ethnography. Ethnography has also made its way into the toolboxes of researchers from a number of disciplines. And so for most of us here at this webinar, we're kind of a long way from Boas's ethnography. The traditional ethnography that's been part of training for many anthropologists usually includes long stints of field work, sometimes 1 or more years in the field. And the goals are usually to understand these really broad cultural phenomena by documenting and interpreting human life. And this can be wonderful and immersive research that enables its practitioners to develop this really deep understanding of culture. But that's not really what we're going to focus on today. So if you're working in a UX or consumer insights role, many of you are likely to have projects with really short timelines. Instead of focusing on really broad topics, the research that you're doing usually needs you to help develop an understanding for a specific design problem, or you're asked to really do work that yields measurable impact for some type of a service or product. So the work that you're doing just has really different parameters than what a lot of anthropologists are setting out to do with the more traditional ethnography. At the same time, this doesn't prevent you from using ethnography if you choose. There's just some things that have to be tweaked. So when we think about like how ethnography might work for a UX practitioner, I really suggest thinking about these following steps as you give ethnography a try. So of course, the first thing is determine if ethnography is really a good fit for your needs. There's just going to be some cases where ethnography isn't the right methodology for what you need to do, for the questions that you need to answer. So just kind of figuring out why ethnography might be a good fit is like a wonderful first step. Also, before you get into the field, this might be something that some folks are resistant to, especially since there's the fact that like we have these short timelines. But I would really suggest that you take a moment for self-reflection before getting into the field, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Should also probably consider recruiting a team. And of course, prepare for your site visit so that you can hit the ground running. One of the things that you will not have as a UX practitioner that is really common for ethnographers that are working in this more traditional ethnographic research is that the type of research that many anthropologists are getting to do in, say, a dissertation study is like they spend a very long time embedded in a community. So they have time to sort of figure things out. For a lot of UX researchers, we have a week, sometimes less, to come out with something that's going to have impact. So you really need to move quickly. Now, next, of course, in your workflow, you're probably going to get into the field, observe, interact, and be present while fielding. And you'll also go through this process of data interpretation and communicating user experience. Today, I'm not really going to talk too much about those last two steps because I think there's some really great resources out there to help you. And it's likely that you already have your own practices that work really well here. Many of you are probably already pretty familiar with qualitative research, with like moderation. You have plenty of experience here. And also when it comes to the ways that you do analysis and data interpretation, you've got some things that you've already found work for you. So I'm not going to suggest that you throw those out the window. So why ethnography? The real question here is, what's your goal? So do you need in-depth understanding of some type of a problem area? Are you looking for insights into people's lives that can drive product innovation? If your goal is to gather product feedback, let's say usability, or just general opinions on a topic, or you are trying to collect the necessary data to size an opportunity in a market, ethnography is probably not an ideal fit for you. But if you need to gain in-depth understanding of a problem, like let's say vacation planning, ethnography is probably something that you should consider. And so as you consider like actually how this happens, I'm going to start off with just talking about the fact that we're going to do this is research that's done in context. People are really complex. They're really tough to get. And commonly used qualitative research methods like usability testing, focus groups, and interviews rely on research subjects to provide this logical account of an experience. And sometimes in research, you hear these stories that seem to contradict. Now, if you focus on, say, decision-making as something that as like a cognitive exercise, this contradictory reports that you're going to get from participants sometimes might present as a problem. One might assume that this is the result of some type of a lapse. So for example, your participant is confused. maybe the participant is just making a mistake, some type of mistake happened. But if we were to take a lesson from anthropology, these moments where we see conflict in people's accounts of an event or in their explanation of logic, very often it can be also viewed as this understandable behavior within some sort of a cultural system. So in moments where discussions seem to find their limits, where the interview alone is something that sort of leads you in a place where you're just kind of confused because you're getting kind of like data that seems to be contradictory, this is an invitation really to look closer through participant observation. So for a lot of us that are working in UX, conducting research in a lab is something that's part of the work that we're doing on a regular basis. And doing research here is really wonderful from a logistics and process perspective. And a good lab can really contribute to controlled environments that can help a researcher be really efficient. So this type of environment makes high quality data collection really simple. It can also save you a lot of time by allowing your participants to come to you. And of course, it's accessible to your stakeholders who can easily observe. So without a doubt, a research facility is a great resource. But when you need to understand people, how they relate to some problem area that's the focus of your design work, or you want to just understand how they use products in their everyday lives, it's really important to remember that these controlled environments in labs are really different from where your users are actually spending their time. So while interviewing is this really important part of ethnographic work, we should keep in mind that we're going to get incomplete responses, contradictory responses, and participants might even struggle to recall things that they've done in the past. And so by joining them in their homes, their workplaces, spaces of leisure, we can watch them and discuss as they experience the things in their day-to-day that they often forget. So the next question is, what type of engagement do you expect to have with the topic that you're focused on today? While you can't really spend an entire year doing field work, you probably could spend a year working on a product or some type of a design problem. So it makes sense to really consider what your long-term game could look like. So another question is, could you use a series of short projects to develop a deeper understanding of an experience, a community, or a phenomenon? New ethnographers often learn that they've only scratched the surface of their topic area after these initial attempts at rapidly executing ethnographic research. But even if your project is ended, you might not have finished with your topic. And so revisiting your field work to build upon earlier insights really will allow you to develop greater, it'll allow you a greater opportunity and of course more time to go deeper on these complex topics. So what you might find is that we are often tasked with learning specific types of things and like different points of the sort of design workflow as you're figuring out what to build. This is, of course, a wonderful time to include ethnography. But if you're also doing this work that is, if you are pressed to continue moving on to something else, and it can be pretty difficult to get back and continue that learning. But I would argue that it makes a lot of sense not to restrict this type of research, this type of learning to this one point of the design process, because it's very likely that gaining a deeper understanding of this problem area is one, possible, and two, is going to help you as you continue this work. So a workflow that looks like this thing on the top, where ethnography exists in the sort of what to build stage alone. That, of course, is one way to use it, but I would suggest trying the second, which is really just enabling you to continue to build upon your learnings and sort of provide deeper insights as the the project continues. So you may have heard people talk about ethnographic research as like fly on the wall research. And this is a really attractive idea. Despite the fact that this photo is not attractive, the idea of being able to just like be invisible, see what's happening is actually wonderful. But I would argue that it's not really an option for an ethnographer. So depending on the work you need to do, you're probably going to enter participants' homes or ride in their cars, and you could observe and learn things about people's lives that you hadn't imagined. And so you're really going to experience these moments with your participants, but without a doubt, your presence will be noted. In addition, your presence is also going to influence participants' behavior. And for this reason, I think it's really important to consider what your presence could actually mean to your participants. So just to speak personally, one of the things that I like to think about before I enter the field is, what are these different aspects of my own identity that could potentially be things that I have to work around, that I can work with quite easily, things that are going to be potential assets while I'm, face to face with someone, and things that I just need to just be cautious of. Most of us can probably think of ourselves. We can probably use the following dimensions to sort of like talk about who we are. So very often I think about race, gender, class, my employment, so like who I work for, as well as things like origin and the research that I need to do. And of course, none of these need to be considered obstacles that can't be overcome, but taking some time to consider them while you're planning your project is a good idea. At times we find ourselves in these situations that can feel really awkward for ourselves and for our participants. That's actually not a bad thing, but it's important that we do things like ensure safety while making everyone as comfortable as possible with the idea that you, a stranger, could access or at least ask for access to these really intimate details of your participant's life. So one of the things that I've found is that, I am I'm a man. I could end up doing a study that takes me into people's homes. And there could be people, especially potentially women, that are uncomfortable with the idea of having, letting some strange man into their home. And there's some ways to deal with this, and I will be talking about that now. So with respect to composing your team, this isn't an absolute necessity, but I do think it's a good idea for you to consider who you might team up with while you're considering or conducting a study. And aside from safety, as many of you probably know, there's lots of researchers who would rather not enter someone's home alone. There's a lot of researchers that probably work in teams in these moments. But I think aside from safety, there's some reasons for choosing a partner for your research. Some of those include things like you have more eyes. So, I'm going to see things the way that I see them. The stakeholders who I may take into the field with me, or the other researchers that I'm working with, may see things in a very different way. And I absolutely love the opportunity to include more observers so that we can bring more information into these, into the sort of interpretive work that we're going to do at a later point. Another reason for composing a team is, of course, you can have these dedicated roles and responsibilities. So, for example, note-taking and media-related tasks. I think this is actually one of my favorite reasons for bringing people into the field with me. And I'll explain this a little bit more later, but for the most part, I want the responsibilities that have to do with data retention to be out of my hands if I am responsible for moderating an interview in ethnographic research. Another is, of course, you need this shared awareness of a research plan and roles. And so before getting into the field, you definitely want to provide these guidelines for behavior that can be expected during these sessions. This could, these are things that you'll want people to be familiar with as you enter the field. They could have to do with these media roles that I just mentioned. It could have to do with the note-taking, but it also has a lot to do with making sure everybody's on the same page with respect to what you're covering. And also everybody kind of understands appropriate behavior while you are either visiting people in their homes or spending time with them in these spaces that are certainly not as familiar to us as they probably are for the participants in our research. Your teammates also serve as wonderful debrief partners. So this is where you can come together, see like the different ways that you guys have sort of seen those experiences of being with your participants. The chances are your different backgrounds, your different disciplinary, or let's say your different functional roles on your team will probably lead you to different places. And it's really good for you as a researcher to be aware of those differences, and so that you can just prepare to make sense of them and incorporate them before you're finished with your project. And then, of course, like one of the most important things here, or probably the most important thing, if you ask me, is you want to compose your team so that they can help you manage some of those potential challenges that you might have considered during that sort of self-reflective stage. So I mentioned that I am a man. I understand that my presence in, a home when I'm interviewing some, let's say, a woman or really anybody who's not comfortable with like me being in their personal space. Like one of the ways that I've dealt with this is that I absolutely love having mixed gender teams going out into the field. So I completely expect that if I am going to have only one other person with me, I think it's a good idea for me to try to find a female coworker that can support me in this research, because if nothing else, that is going to potentially get me over some sort of social obstacles that I might face in the field myself. Also, as you are preparing for field work, you'll really have to think about who and where you need to visit. And of course, this is something that you may have thought about a lot already. You'll need to specify who can provide this relevant data for you to understand the problem that you're focused on. And you should also prepare to meet these participants where they engage in those related activities as well. So if this is the first time you're doing this, you'll probably learn pretty quickly what types of participants are difficult to recruit, who might serve as the best hosts for you and your team to learn from, and of course, the types of locations that can make relevant topics easy to explore. But some of the things that you might want to consider are, as you're thinking about, the types of places you should prepare people to take you. And in a lot of cases, I suggest actually letting people know beforehand that you're probably going to ask them to take you certain places, whether that means like you'll tour their home, or you're going to ask them to take you to popular places that they like to go. Letting them know that's going to happen is I think, a good idea. But as you're sort of planning this research, you want to think like, where can you observe the experiences that are going to be telling for the things that you're trying to learn. Also, where do your participants feel comfortable? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean where they feel at home. This could also mean where where do you think it's going to be? Where will they be most open to your presence? So while someone's home is probably a place where they're extremely comfortable, having you, a stranger, in that home is not necessarily the most comforting thought for them. So that might mean going to some other location to do this type of work. And of course, um, you should probably consider what types of topics you're going to need to discuss. If you are discussing sensitive topics, you'll probably need more private places. It's going to be pretty difficult for you to talk about topics that are more taboo, you know, potentially illegal, things like this, if you are in public places. So public places can be absolutely wonderful for thinking about how people experience public places. But if you're going to talk about things, if you're going to explore topics that are not necessarily the things people want to discuss in public, that's going to be a challenge for you. So you should feel free to try to be as flexible as possible in the field, and you know you're not stuck in any one place once you get there. So try to figure out where the information loosens up. Location actually will be pretty important for this. So since you're not in the lab, you really don't know what's going to be available to you once you get into the field. To give an example, I recently took a team on a series of interviews in some participants' homes outside of the US. And during these interviews, we ended up sitting on things like the steps or on the floor. We worked in these really dimly lit and small living spaces, and we were also in homes that were within these neighborhoods that were really noisy. So understandably, this made recording audio and video pretty complicated. And it also meant my stakeholders and I didn't have access to certain comforts that are really common in research facilities. Not necessarily fancy stuff, but you know, chairs and tables, those aren't things you can always expect when you're in the field. So you should probably expect that children, family members, friends, and pets might pop up. And depending on the nature of the work that you're doing, you might need to diplomatically request that other people not be present. And on the other hand, you might be able to shift your plans to incorporate additional participants. And this is something that can actually be pretty helpful for studies that are related to, say, shared decision making. So, for example, if you are doing research on vacation planning, the chances are this is a topic that for people who don't live alone, if you're not single, like the chances are this is not an individual decision. So having additional people present who are part of that decision making process might be that actually might be a gift. Also, as you're preparing to go into the field, I think that there's a lot of discussion about preparing field kits. This includes things like some people will suggest that you include water and snacks and all of this sort of stuff. That's not a bad idea at all. I encourage you to do that. But for me, the most important things for me to bring into the field with me is some type of I want pens, I want a notebook, and I want some type of a camera. For a lot of us, that means it could be as simple as the photo on the screen where you've got a phone, a couple of pens, and like a small notebook. That may work perfectly fine. But you can also add simple mobile and quality recording equipment that can allow you fast setup and breakdown. I think this is a really good idea to do this. And since I prefer to spend as much of my time and attention on my participant as possible, I really enjoy using tools like GoPros and LiveScribe pins so that I can minimize my own responsibilities for detailed note taking. So whenever I lead research or serve as a moderator for a project, I really want to think as little as possible about data retention. So good and redundant recording equipment is something that I consider pretty important. It's especially important if you're working alone. Now, if you have a dedicated note taker, that's wonderful. Ideally, you'll be able to rely on those notes for your analysis, which will really help you move quickly on the back end of your project. Now, as you're going into the field, you're going to be face to face with people. You're going to have short amounts of time. This is where I think a lot of the work that you've already done, or that you've probably already done in qualitative research is really going to help you a lot. Of course, I think quickly developing rapport, being present in your interview, these are things that are essential for the work that you're going to undertake in people's sort of spaces in their lives. Some of the things that you'll see are probably going to be really helpful for you that are probably different from some of the things that happen a lot of the times in some of the spaces like a research lab, is like as you're entering people's homes, trying to develop that rapport. You really don't want to act like you're at work. Like this is something that's kind of tough to do if you're walking people into a lab, and like you're clearly the person in charge. But as you're going into other people's homes, as you're riding in their cars, as you're letting them guide you to different places, one of the things that's going to be really important is kind of like not making them feel like you're at work. So being cool with people, helping them relax and just like take charge of the interview or the sort of those moments of observation are going to be really helpful for you as you execute the field work. And of course, while you are with people, you should be checking out, check out the scenes. This could mean if you're in someone's home, take a tour. If you need to understand how people, cook dinner, spend a lot of time in that kitchen, maybe even cook with people. If you are doing a study about shopping, don't ask them how they shop, like go shopping with them. So I think it's really up to you to figure out what scenes you need to see. But the main thing that's important here is that you don't just restrict this to a conversation, and you use these opportunities to allow people to experience whatever it is that you're interested in as much as possible, instead of just relying on stories about it. Now, as you finish up your work, you are going to move on to analysis and reporting. This, again, is an area that you probably already have some tools that you've learned work well here. So whether that means you're using things like qualitative data analysis software, whether it means you're using things like affinity mapping to sort of get to your insights quickly, there's no reason for you to start over. Those are perfectly fine tools. And so I think in a lot of ways, the work that needs to be done to prepare you for at least dipping your toe in the water of an ethnographic project is going to be that sort of pre-work before you get into the field, to sort of prepare you, your team, and make sure you're in the right places to develop the deeper learnings that you're after. So thank you all. So I'm going to check out the questions.
Hey, Giles, thanks so much for this talk. It was great. Yeah, so if anybody has questions, please send them questions, like use the GoToWebinar control panel, and then Giles will answer. We have about 20 minutes to discuss.
And so I apologize. It looks like audio cut out at some point. I hope you got to hear something, Linda. So someone asked, can you give us an example or two of when ethnography went wrong and what you learned from it? Ethnography gone wrong. Let's see. I can definitely talk about examples where I've had tough moments in the field, but I can't say that I've had like entire projects just fall apart. Now, when it comes to like tough moments that, like, let's say an interview feels like it was extremely rough. One of the times that this has happened to me was during a project where I needed to talk to people about some experiences they had had in the most recent 2 years. For this project, many people had lots of really good things to talk about. They were more than happy to share their experiences, and so it was really kind of easy to sort of get them to talk about the experiences that they had had and sort of like show me evidence of like the good times. One participant that I ended up interviewing had experienced a number of really negative moments in this period that we were covering, and at every point of that conversation, I had to get this participant to talk about unpleasant experiences. And so throughout that interview, throughout the time in her house, as we're sort of like discussing her past, I had to deal with a lot of distractions, like the family pet, who was a comforter, family, listening to TV loudly. We had a lot of distractions for a very difficult discussion, and I was certainly frustrated through some of this, in part because like there were so many things that were just out of my control, and it was kind of unpleasant for my participant to sort of talk about all of these things, and we simply powered through it. We went through, I believe it was close to a 3-hour interview. We spent nearly all 3 of those hours talking about things that we needed to because of the project. But it was a moment where you definitely learn to kind of deal with the unpleasantness. And also, this was also a project where I think I had to very quickly learn that you have to be really flexible in the field, because like it's just not worth it to chase down certain lines of questioning when you know that it's not going to yield a lot of results. When people are talking about things that are really painful, and you haven't done the like built the proper relationships with people to access that, it can be extremely tough, and you might not need to press people so hard. So okay, so there's a question about LiveScribe. LiveScribe is a wonderful tool. It's really simple. There's different versions of it, but really all of them do the same thing. The LiveScribe pen enables you to record audio while taking notes. And it's all done within, in some cases, just with a pen. Sometimes you have to link it to other tools like your phone. The reason why this is a good tool to use is that later, once you've finished the project, no one, I shouldn't say no one, I don't want to have to listen to listen or watch, let's say, I don't know, 2 hours, 3 hours of interview in order to just refresh my memory, to see the things that are really important to me. So while you're using the LiveScribe and you're writing, it's recording simultaneously, and you can always refer back to a specific point in your recording by sort of tapping on that point in the PDF that it creates for you. So it makes it really easy for you to retrieve information and find it after an interview is already finished. Okay, so what is something that practitioners tend to overlook when planning ethnography studies? Hmm. So I think one of the things that I would say, like people who are newer to ethnography, what I've seen happen even on projects that are that go well is that I think this idea of really getting to the depth that they realize that there's so much more depth that they haven't covered, that they feel that there's some sort of a failure, something went wrong. There must have been a way to get more information, and this is part of the reason why I think that it's really beneficial for researchers to think about the ways that you can extend your engagement in the field. So this is why, like, I don't think that we should be thinking about, yes, for the project work that you do, you have to think about projects. You have to think about these moments in the field where you might be there for days, you might be there for a week, but the chances are many many UX researchers are working on a domain. And this is an opportunity for us to continue to visit the field, maybe not necessarily in the same location with the same participants, but we do have an ability to use those learnings every time we come out of the field to build upon plans for future work. And I think that when people that are doing ethnography in industry, one of the things that I see happening a lot is that people sort of treat the project like that, like it's its own thing, as opposed to a project that is part of a larger program, an opportunity to learn and develop insights. So there's a question here. I teach in a program where students are focused on addressing problems in the workplace. And so problems and products relate to understanding workplace problems and what may be required to improve work contexts. Do you see that as a type of product or design issue in organizations where ethnography is used? I think these are extremely related. So if it's a product, then that's fine. If we're talking about I don't think there's a huge difference between trying to understand product versus service versus, like, all of these are based on our ability to sort of understand. In your place, like, this is all about workplace culture. And so you're trying to figure out, I assume, what types of products, what types of solutions in general could fix or address something that you're seeing in this space. I think that I don't necessarily know if the goals that you have for this are necessarily directed at design problems or solving this with a product. But I do think that at least that process of exploring what's happening in the workplace, this sort of organizational research, using ethnography for that reason, isn't especially different from trying to understand, say, shopping in someone's home. Like you're trying to understand a phenomenon. You're trying to understand how people approach a topic, and that topic could be shopping, it could be planning vacations, it could be work itself. Now, the mechanics of what that actually looks like may change, but I still see them as like similar types of similar types of problems that could be I don't want to say addressed, but could be learned about using some similar tools like ethnographic research. Okay, how do you generally get stakeholders from a UX standpoint to agree that the cost and time necessary for ethnographic research is worth it? I think one of the things here is I think stakeholders are more open to the cost, and I mean, I guess we can refer to time as part of the cost, but stakeholders are probably far more open to this type of work if you are proposing it at the right time within the workflow, the design workflow. So when people are still trying to figure out what they should build, this is a wonderful time to get everybody on board for something like ethnographic research. Now, another thing is that there might be different reasons for why stakeholders decide they are or are not in favor of this type of work. If people think that the time cost is too high, the question I would ask is this their time? Do they not want to join you in the field, or is the problem really that they believe that the research itself will take too long to do? If this is about like stakeholders not wanting to join you in field because they're too busy to join you, stakeholders don't need to be there for everything. This is work that also could be broken up into different groups of stakeholders. In fact, this way you actually get more people to see things, and that could result in a situation where you have more kind of evangelists of your findings in the end. Now, if you're talking about ethnographic research itself taking too much time, I don't think that has to be the case. I think for the most part, if you are trying to get ethnographic research to, I think that you can fit an ethnographic research project, fielding that within a week if you have to. And if you have people in the field with you, there's ways for you to sort of deliver like sort of high level, big insights relatively quickly. And I don't think that that's terribly costly. Of course, if you have more time, I think you get far more out of it. And another thing that I believe is that it's perfectly fine for you to deliver something in the immediate sort of like immediately following a research project, knowing that the sort of more meaty work that's going to take more time, because that's where the interpretive work happens, that can be delivered at a later point. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways you can make your timelines fit whatever's necessary and still come up with really meaningful work. Okay, there's a question here. If you have recommendations for those who are classically trained ethnographers or cultural anthropologists to cut their teeth on ethnographic projects outside of academia. So I think that like one of the things that can probably be done is you want to find a stakeholder. A really major difference between the type of work that gets done within academia by these classically trained ethnographers or cultural anthropologists is like we have long timelines and we kind of own our own research. Like the research projects that I did in the past were projects that like I arrived at because of my own intellectual interest. What you end up working on in industry ideally, it's stuff that you are interested in. In fact, you'll probably develop interest in it because you know, you're probably a curious person. That's who ends up being researchers in a lot of cases. But I would say go find a stakeholder. If that means working with NGOs, if that means working with some sort of a partner within a university, if you're working within a university, you know, find somebody who's trying to address a problem, look for a solution, and try to work within those constraints. And I think this is a really good training ground. So like that will help learning how to work a little bit faster, and also making sure that people who are not anthropologists, not ethnographers in the end, are on the same page as you, can sort of start talking like you at the end of that. That should also be a goal, something to practice. So there's something here about organizational anthropology. It doesn't seem to cross paths much with people working in UX. Yeah, so I think and maybe this is in part related to the fact that many people working in UX are focused on product design, maybe service design. Now, I think yeah, I think there's certainly a distinction between the two, because like you're focused on different types of potentially different types of problems. But I think ultimately, despite the fact that like people are sort of working in these different roles, they're not necessarily always communicating a whole lot. I do think they do similar work in terms of trying to understand problems so that they can find solutions. Like ultimately, that's what we're all trying to do as UX researchers, and what I believe organizational researchers are also up to. So how would you go shopping with someone within an online context? So on Amazon or eBay. So I mean, I think there's like established methods that work really well for a question like this. In this case, there's work that's related to sort of like ethnography, online ethnography, but I think this is a really good fit for something like contextual inquiry. So as much as I love ethnography, I think there are other methods that that are sort of based on similar ideas. In this case, contextual inquiry being one that is focused on really understanding how people accomplish tasks and you know, undergo these processes through sort of this contextual research. So for a contextual research, or I'm sorry, contextual inquiry project, part of that would entail going to someone and shopping with them. If they're doing this online, then maybe you're sitting right next to them, watching them shop. So that's one way of going about it. When you work with a team, how do you decide on the best interpretation or analysis of data? Is it easy to come to consensus? So I actually don't think that consensus should be the goal. I think that within a lot of the projects that we work on, at least in the places that I've worked, projects have owners. You have somebody who's responsible for them. I think it's up to that person to really call make the calls. Now, I think that it's important to be able to take input from different sources, from your stakeholders, from your partners, and ultimately you want your stakeholders to be on board with what you're working on. And so there's absolutely a process of sort of like working together to find the right approach. But I think that the work that we're doing in sort of ethnography and corporate environments is very often, there's a couple of things that are happening. One is the sort of data collection interpretation that is I think very familiar to anthropologists and sort of these classically trained ethnographers. Now, what's different here is that at least in the world, and the experience that I had in the past was that I was not responsible for getting someone on board to change something. I'm not trying to influence somebody who can change a product, who can build a service. And so I think that some of the things that have to be considered are, feasibility, what is, what's possible within this organization, either because of what people want to do or because of what people have been empowered to do, and who your audience is. And so I think that's a second part of the work. That's a really important part of sort of communicating and delivering that work. But I don't think it's about consensus. I think it's about sort of weighing the perspectives. And in the same way that you're trying to do this interpretive work with your participants, hopefully you're doing something similar even within the organization that you work within to be able to see things from your colleagues' perspectives. You're trying to make sense of like how they think about things on their terms so that you can convey these other findings, communicate experiences that are not theirs to them in a way that's compelling enough for them to sort of believe you. So I think that this is less of a problem when we have people in field with us, though. This sort of these moments where people doubt or fight against your interpretation or analysis of the data, I think it's far more likely to happen when people are not in field with you. When people are in field with me, I think that one, they see what the work entails. They've seen the same things that you've seen, and you're helping them make sense of it. So I haven't had lots of pushback when it comes to the stakeholders who are collaborating with me in the research.
Hi, Giles. I'm gonna have to interrupt you because it's like past 5 p.m. and we really appreciate your time and so much good examples and things that we discussed today. Thanks so much for leading this webinar today. As I said before, we are going to share the link of the presentation soon and also the slides. So thanks so much for joining today. I'm looking forward to meeting you again in the next webinar. Thank you. Thanks, Giles.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun, and I hope to continue this conversation maybe at a UXPA conference or something like that. So thanks a lot, everybody.